The restaurant went quiet the second I set the leather portfolio down next to my mother's wine glass. 22 years of silence, and now a private dining room full of relatives, all of them holding their breath. My mother had just finished telling the table that I'd abandoned the family, that I was hoarding my grandmother's money. My twin sister sat at the far end, too thin, not looking at anyone. My father's jaw was working like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. I rested 2 fingers on the dark leather. I didn't open it yet. What I pulled out of that portfolio is the reason my parents haven't spoken to me since. But to understand how I ended up standing in that room. You have to go back to the night they decided one daughter was enough. Welcome back to their secret stories, where we tell the kind of family stories that stay with you long after the table's been cleared A1heen. I'm Vera. If a story ever made you feel less alone, drop your city and the time in the comments, and be sure to subscribe. Let me tell you who I am before they try to tell you for me. I'm a livestock veterinarian in Silveridge, Colorado. Population just under 3,000, most of them cattle ranchers and horse breeders. I set fractured limbs on draft horses at 3 in the morning. I've had my hands deep in a stallion's chest while freezing rain came sideways through a barn door. So when people ask if confrontation scares me, I have to laugh. Blood doesn't scare me. People who smile while they lie to you, that's different. My husband Julian restores classic vintage tractors and runs 40 acres of organic peach orchard we lease from the co-op. We have 2 kids. Hazel is 7 and asks why constantly. Leo is 4 and thinks every retriever in the county belongs to him. We're not rich. We're rooted hair one fiend. That word matters because for a long time, I wasn't rooted anywhere. I built this life with my own 2 hands and a borrowed flatbed. And I never once asked the people who raised me for the first 12 years to help Hawan. They wouldn't have anyway. I'd made my peace with that. Or I thought I had. Then one Tuesday in February, I was scrubbing antiseptic off my hands at the clinic sink when my phone lit up with a Pennsylvania number. I almost didn't answer. Telemarketers love that area code, but something made me wipe my hands and pick up. There was a pause on the line, a breath I hadn't heard in 2 decades. Then a voice, careful and sweet, the way you talk to a skittish mare you weren't sure would bolt. Vera, sweetheart, it's your mother. I set the towel down very slowly. My mother does not call me sweetheart. My mother does not call me at all. I stood in that bright little room smelling of iodine and pine, and I felt the floor of my whole steady life tilt about 3 degrees. Whatever she wanted, it wasn't me. You don't forget the night your parents give you away. I was 12. It was spring, and there was a duffel bag by the front door that wasn't mine. Except it was, because my sweaters were folded inside it. I remember the smell of roast chicken. Nobody was eating. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table with that same careful voice. Vera, You're going to go stay with Uncle Jasper for a while. A while. I held on to that word like a handrail. I asked how long. My father, reading the evening paper, didn't look up. We'll see how it goes. My twin sister, Genevieve, was upstairs with her tutor. There had been a state debate tournament that month. She'd won the championship trophy. There were ribbons on the fridge, a brand, new leather planner on her desk, and a feeling in that house that the future had finally arrived. And it only had enough room in the car for one of us. I didn't cause trouble. I want you to know that. I got average grades. I sketched landscapes in the margins of my notebooks. I wasn't a difficult child. I just wasn't a prodigy. And in that house, those had become the exact same thing. Jasper's truck pulled into the driveway around 7. My mother walked me out, her hand resting light on my shoulder, as if pressing harder would make the reality too heavy to carry. She kissed the crown of my head and said, "Be good for your uncle." Then she went back inside before the truck had even backed down the gravel road. I watched the kitchen window. The light was warm and amber. Through the glass, I could see my mother lift the platters off the table, scraping the uneaten chicken into the trash, getting on with her evening. A while turned into the rest of my childhood. But at 12, sitting in Jasper's rattling truck with the heater blowing dust, I still believed they'd come back for me. They didn't. I need you to understand the math of that house, because everything that happened later runs on it. My parents had twins, and they decided early that we were an investment portfolio. Genevieve tested into the gifted program in 2nd grade. I didn't. From that day forward, the resources flowed in a single direction. Genevieve got the private tutors, the summer academic camps, the classical cello lessons. She eventually quit. I got me, Downs, and a library card. Nobody was cruel about it. Exactly. That's what made it so hard to name. My mother had her own disappointment buried under all of it. She'd been accepted to a prestigious master's program in architecture the year she got pregnant with us, and she never went. She talked about it the way some veterans talk about a war they barely survived. Genevieve was going to be the version of my mother that the world had cheated her out of. And me, I was overhead. I was the part of the budget you trim. My father ran a struggling commercial printing press and thought only in terms of return on investment. I heard him say it once threw the heating grate in the floor the year before they sent me away. My mother had asked quietly whether they were being fair to me. My father's answer came up through the metal vents as clear as if he'd been standing at the foot of my bed. "We can only invest in one future, Diana. You spread it thin, you lose them both." I was 11. I lay on the wood floor with my ear pressed to the brass grate and learned exactly what I was worth on a balance sheet. I didn't tell anyone. I just got very, very quiet and very good at not needing anything. For years, I thought that vent had let me in on a secret. It hadn't. It had let me in on a decision they'd already made. The duffel bag by the door was just the paperwork catching up to the math. Uncle Jasper was my father's older brother, and the two of them hadn't spoken in years. Jasper had left the city to raise horses and run an orchard, and my father considered that a failure of ambition. So, when Jasper took me in, my parents got to tell themselves I'd landed somewhere lesser, which made it easier to stop thinking about me entirely. The ranch was 40 minutes outside Silveridge, and the first week I cried into a pillow that smelled like lavender and old timber. Jasper and his wife, Evelyn, didn't push. Evelyn just kept setting a third plate at the pine table like I'd always belonged there. The second week, Jasper knocked on my door before dawn. "Got a mare foaling," he said. "You can watch, or you can sleep." I watched. I held the lantern while a nervous mare strained, and Jasper talked her through it in a low, gravelly hum. And when that wet, impossible foal finally slid onto the straw and shook its head, something in my chest came loose that I didn't have a word for yet. Evelyn taught me that you feed people whether or not they've earned it. Jasper taught me that you show up at 3 in the morning for things that can't speak for themselves. Neither of them ever once made me feel like overhead. By the end of that first year, I had stopped flinching when someone reached out to pat my shoulder. I made myself a promise out behind the stables, the kind of fierce, stubborn promise only a 12-year-old can make. I swore I would never need my parents for anything ever again. I'd build a life so solid they couldn't take a single brick of it. I kept that promise for 22 years. What I didn't plan for was the day they'd come looking. Not to take a brick, but to claim the whole house. And the only person who saw it coming was the one relative I thought had forgotten I existed. The work saved me. By 14, I could give a yearling an injection without my hands shaking. By 16, I was the one Jasper trusted in the barn alone. Animals don't grade you. They don't care if your sister won a debate tournament. They just need you to be steady and on time, and I could do both. Somewhere in there, I figured out I wanted to be a vet. And once I knew it, I locked onto it like a shepherd dog onto a stray sheep. But the part that still cracks me open is the cards. 3 or 4 times a year, an envelope would show up at the ranch, addressed in a looping, old-fashioned hand. Inside, a card, sometimes a folded $20 bill, and a few lines that always ended the same way. Thinking of you. Love, Grandma Adeline. My grandmother Adeline was my father's mother. And somehow, against the entire tide of that family, she had decided not to forget me. She never said a bad word about my parents in those cards. She didn't have to. The fact of the cards said it for her. While my mother and father were busy pretending I'd evaporated, Adeline kept a string tied between us, one card at a time. I'd write back about the horses. She'd write back asking their names. When I got into veterinary school, she sent a card that simply said, "Of course you did. I always knew. I have it still, for a long time." Those cards were the only thread connecting me to the bloodline I came from. And I assumed that's all they'd ever be. A quiet kindness from an old woman in an assisted living cottage 2 towns over. I had no idea she was doing anything more than loving me from a distance. I had no idea she was watching, calculating, keeping records in a cedar box. And I had no idea how little time was left to thank her until the morning Evelyn's old home phone number lit up my screen with news about Adeline's heart. I want to skip ahead because the good years deserve their own breath 8-1 keen. I finished vet school with more debt than sense and came straight back to Silveridge because it was the only place that had ever felt like mine. I bought into old Dr. Miller's practice when he retired, and then I bought him out entirely. I met Julian at a hardware supply store when his truck battery died and mine had jumper cables. We married in Jasper's North Peach Orchard. Evelyn lived long enough to dance. At that wedding, slow and careful, 3 months before lung illness took her. Then came Hazel, and then Leo. And a life that on paper looked small, but felt boundlessly one. I had a thriving practice, a husband, 2 kids who climbed me like a tree, and an uncle who'd gone gray and stooped but still came to Sunday dinner. I had everything those people in Pennsylvania had decided I wasn't worth the investment to give Hay 1, and I never sent them a single update. Not a graduation announcement, not a birth notice A1, not out of spite, out of survival. I had built a house with no doors facing their direction, and I liked it that way. Adeline knew it all, of course, through her cards. She knew Hazel's name and Leo's birthday. The last card she sent that Christmas said, "You did the thing I prayed you'd do. You built something they can't ration." I didn't understand the word ration until later. I thought it was just an old woman's phrasing. Then, one Tuesday in February, yes, that February, the same week as the strange call I told you about, Evelyn's old landline number flashed on my screen. Except it wasn't Evelyn. It was the assisted living facility using a directory number still registered to her name. The nurse's voice was gentle and rehearsed. Adeline had suffered a severe stroke. If I wanted to see her, while she could still see me, I should come now. I left the clinic with disinfectant still damp on my hands. The care home was 40 minutes on the other side of Silveridge, and I drove it in 31. Adeline's room smelled of pine, needle lotion, and floor wax. She looked so small in the bed, smaller than the last time I'd seen her, and the stroke had pulled one side of her face down like wet clay. But her eyes found me. They sharpened, and her good hand lifted off the blanket toward me. I took it. Her grip was still there, faint but real. "Vera," she said. It came out slow and slurred, but it was my name. the one only she and Jasper ever used. I told her I was there. I told her not to talk, to save her strength. The useless things we say. She squeezed my fingers to make me stop. She had something to get out, and not much road left to get it out on. "The box," she whispered. "The cedar box at the cottage." I leaned closer. She meant her old place before she moved into assisted living. "There are things in it," she said, each word costing her deeply. "Things you need to know when I'm gone. Promise me you'll open it yourself. Don't let your father near it." I promised. I would have promised her the moon. She looked at me for a long moment, and the working half of her mouth pulled into something that wanted to be a smile. "Good," she said. "Now they can't ration you." There was that word again. I asked her what she meant, but her eyes had already drifted toward the window, toward the gray February light, and her hand had gone loose in mine. The nurse came in then, checking the monitors, her face shifting into that careful blankness they train them for. Adeline slept after that, and the sleep got deeper. And 3 days later, she was gone. I never got to ask her what was in the box. But I'd promised, and I keep my promises. That's the whole problem with me, really. The funeral was small, the way Adeline wanted it. A handful of women from her local parish, a couple of nurses who'd grown fond of her, Jasper leaning heavily on a cane, and me and Julian a one team. My parents didn't come a one. Genevieve didn't come, 22 years of distance. And they couldn't drive 3 hours to bury the woman who had raised my father one. I told myself I wasn't surprised, and I mostly wasn't. What surprised me was Aunt Helena. Helena is my mother's younger sister, 60 years old and built entirely out of opinions about other people's lives. She showed up at the chapel in a heavy fur, trimmed coat, dabbed at eyes that weren't wet, and within 10 minutes had cornered me by the coffee urn. "Such a tragedy," she said. She kept to herself at the end. Didn't she? Did she ever? Get her affairs in order. I just looked at her. Helena plowed on, lowering her voice to the register people reserved for cash. Because there was the rental property, and Adeline was always careful with $1. Your mother just wonders who's handling all of that as family. There it was. They hadn't come to mourn. They'd sent a scout. I told Helena that the estate lawyer was handling it, which was true. I watched the word lawyer land on her like a dropped plate. She recovered fast. "Well, I'm sure it'll all be fair," she said, in a tone that meant she intended to make sure it was fair to the right people. She squeezed my arm with cold fingers and clicked away on her heels to find better cell service for whatever call she was about to make. I stood by the urn with my paper cup and understood something cold and clarifying. My grandmother wasn't even in the ground yet, and the family that had written me off had suddenly remembered my address. The only question left was how much they thought was in the box. The lawyer's name was Miriam Thorne, and she had an office above a pharmacy in Silveridge with a radiator that knocked like it had strong opinions. She'd been Adeline's attorney for 15 years, which surprised me. I'd assumed an old woman in assisted living didn't keep a lawyer on a 15-year retainer. Miriam had reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had watched a lot of families behave badly over wills. She slid a thick blue folder across the desk. "Your grandmother was specific," she said, "and she was meticulous. I want you to understand that before we go through any of this, that none of this was a last-minute decision. Adeline had left me the bulk of her estate. The assisted living cottage was leased, but Adeline owned her old house outright, a tidy property she'd rented out for years, plus a savings account she'd fed steadily for 2 decades. The total made my ears ring. It wasn't life, changing money to a Wall Street banker. To a rural vet with school debt and 2 kids, it was a completely different sky Hawan. But Miriam wasn't finished. She set 2 more things on the desk, a sealed envelope with my name across the front in that looping hand, and a cedar box, the lid worn smooth. Exactly the box Adeline had made me promise to open myself. She left instructions. Miriam said, "You open the letter and the box alone." And she added a specific clause. "I'll be frank. In 15 years, I've drafted this clause maybe twice." She looked at me over her glasses. A no contest provision. Anyone who challenges this will and loses forfeits anything they might otherwise have received. Your grandmother seemed to expect a challenge. I asked from whom. Miriam's expression didn't change. She didn't name them, but she told me to make sure everything was airtight. She wanted to make sure it went to you, and only you. I drove home with the sealed letter on the passenger seat and didn't open it yet. I wanted to be alone, the right kind of alone. I'd barely set the envelope on my kitchen counter when the Pennsylvania number called again. I let it ring twice while I decided who I wanted to be on this call. Then I answered. My mother's voice poured out, warm as honey and just as sticky. "Vera, sweetheart, I've been thinking about you so much. Life is just too short, isn't it? We saw the news about your grandmother. God rest her soul. It put everything in perspective." I said nothing. Silence makes liars keep talking. "Your father and I, we have regrets," she went on. "We wasn't perfect. Nobody is. But you're our daughter, and we'd love to put the past where it belongs. Behind us." She let that sit, then landed the hook so smoothly I almost admired it. "We want to have a family dinner, everyone. You, Genevieve, the aunts. A fresh start. Will you come? Now, here's where I want to be honest with you. Because I've heard people say they'd have hung up right then. Maybe you would have. But 22 years is a long time to carry an empty space where parents should be." Some animal part of me leaned toward that warmth before my brain caught up. Then I heard the timing. My grandmother, 3 weeks dead, an estate freshly mine, and suddenly perspective. Suddenly, a fresh start. People don't get sentimental on a schedule. They get sentimental on a deadline. I asked her evenly, "What's changed?" There was the smallest pause. "We're not getting any younger, sweetheart," she said. "And family should help family." Help. There was the word under all the sugar. I told her I'd think about it. She said she loved me before she hung up. The first time in 22 years, and it landed on me like a coin tossed to a beggar. I stood in my kitchen and looked at Adeline's sealed letter on the counter, and I thought, whatever is in this box, I'd better rid it before I sit at any table they've set. If you're listening to this and thinking about the one person in your family who never made you earn their love, pause this and drop their name in the comments. I waited too long with my grandmother. Don't make my mistake. And if this story is hitting close to home, subscribe to their secret stories so the next one finds you too. I called Miriam the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. I told her about the dinner invitation and the sudden flood of motherly affection. She went quiet in the way that means a professional is choosing her words carefully. "Vera, I'm going to tell you what I tell everyone, and then I'm going to tell you the harder thing," she said. "The easy part? The estate is legally yours. The no contest clause is solid. You don't owe anyone $1 or an explanation. The harder part, solid, doesn't mean painless. If they want to challenge the will, they can file. They'll lose, but they can drag it out for months. They can subpoena. They can make noise. They can poison every family relationship you have left while it wins through probate. I asked if there was anything I could do to lock it down faster. Miriam said the estate had to go through formal settlement, no matter what, and that there was a meeting on the calendar for that in a few days. Until then, keep records, keep your mouth shut publicly, and do not sign anything anyone puts in front of you. Especially, she added, don't sign anything at a dinner. People who plan dinners like this are usually planning more than dinner. I hung up, feeling steadier and worse at the same time. Then my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't have saved, but recognized in my gut. Genevieve, my twin. We hadn't exchanged a single word since we were 12. The text was short, and it didn't sound like the confident prodigy I remembered. It said, "I know this is out of nowhere. Can we talk? Just us, not them. Please." I stared at it a long time. Every instinct said it was part of the same play. Another angle, another scout. But there was a please at the end of it that didn't fit their script. Against my better judgment, I texted back a single line, when and where. We met at a quiet diner in a town halfway between us. Neutral ground, like a prisoner exchange. I almost didn't recognize her. Genevieve had been the golden child, the one with the perfect posture and absolute certainty. The woman who walked in was hollow, cheeked, and hyper, vigilant. Wearing a coat a season too thin, her hands unable to settle. We sat across from each other. Two faces that used to be one face. and for a moment, neither of us could speak. Then she let out a small, broken laugh. "You look like you turned out okay," she said. "God, that's a relief." I asked her why she'd reached out. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. The story came out in jagged pieces. Her education app startup, which our parents had bankrolled and bragged about to anyone who would listen, had collapsed 18 months ago. There were aggressive investors, massive debts she had personally guaranteed, and her marriage had shattered under the pressure. "I'm 34, and I'm living in our parents' basement," she said. "Which is its own special brand of hell. Let me tell you." I felt something I hadn't expected to feel for her. Not triumph, just the recognition of one tired animal by another. "Then," she said, "the thing that changed the temperature of the entire booth. I always wondered about you," she said. "When we were kids, after you left, I asked Mom once where you went. She told me you had chosen to live with Uncle Jasper. She said you liked the ranch better, that you didn't want to come home." I set my mug down very carefully. "Genevieve," I said, "I didn't choose anything. I was 12 years old. They packed a duffel bag and put me in a truck." She went entirely still. Something shifted behind her eyes. Some load, bearing belief cracking at its foundation. "That's not what they told me," she whispered. And right then, in a vinyl diner booth, I realized the lie was bigger and older than I had ever known. I drove straight from that diner to Adeline's old rented house, which was standing empty between tenants. The key felt cold and heavy in my palm. The cedar box was exactly where Miriam's note said it would be, on the top shelf of the hallway closet, wrapped in one of Adeline's woven wool scarves, heavy one. I carried it to the kitchen table, the exact same kind of table where my mother had once told me I was going to stay with my uncle for a while. I sat down. I opened Adeline's letter first because I'd promised, and because I needed her voice before I could look at whatever lay beneath. Then I lifted the lid of the cedar box. On top were photographs. Me at 6, gap-toothed and laughing. Me and Genevieve in matching yellow sundresses. Completely identical. 2 little girls before the family started grading them on a curve. A few photos of me as a teenager on the ranch, which Adeline must have asked Evelyn to mail her over the years. She had been quietly keeping a record of the granddaughter everyone else had discarded. But under the photographs, the temperature of the box changed. There were documents, bank statements, the old-fashioned kind with the perforated edges, a manila envelope soft with handling, legal pages with a notary stamp. My grandmother, the woman who had sent $20 bills and birthday cards, had been quietly assembling a case file for years. This wasn't sentiment. This was evidence. My hands were steady. I set fractured limbs on draft horses at 3 a.m., remember. But my heart was hammering. I knew. The way you know a heavy storm is coming before the sky turns black. that whatever was on those pages was the thing she meant when she said they can't ration you. I squared the stack on the table. I picked up the first bank statement and began line by line to learn exactly what my parents had done with the money that was supposed to be mine. But first, the letter. I have it memorized now, though I keep the paper safe. Adeline's handwriting had gone shaky at the end, but the voice was unmistakably hers. "My dear Vera," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm finally able to tell you the things I held my tongue about for far too long. I was a coward in one specific way. I watched your parents make their choice, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I have regretted that silence every single day. I couldn't undo it. So I did the next best thing. I started keeping what they threw away, including the truth." She wrote that she had suspected, and then confirmed, that my parents hadn't just sent me off. They had stolen from me with both hands while they did it. "There was money meant for both of you girls," she wrote. "Equally. I made sure of that, while I could. What they did with your half, you'll find in the box. I obtained the records through the bank because I had a right to as a co-signer. I'm not leaving you my house and my savings to make you rich, Vera. I'm leaving them to you so that you will never, not once in your life, have to sit at their table and beg for a seat. You earned your seat the day you were born. They're the ones who forgot. Use the box if they force your hand. Don't if they don't. Either way, you are free. Stand up straight. Love, Grandma." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it along the creases and put it back in the envelope. And I sat in that empty kitchen as the afternoon light went long and gold across the floorboards. My grandmother had spent the final years of her life building me a shield, one bank statement at a time, in case the family ever came for me. And now they were coming. The dinner was set, and she had handed me, from beyond the grave, the one thing they never thought I'd have: proof. Here is what the bank statements said in plain English, because numbers can hide cruelty, and I won't let them hide this. When Genevieve and I were small, there had been an account opened in both our names, the Crestview Family Trust. My grandmother's contributions were at the heart of it, built up over the years by relatives and a small inheritance from a great aunt. It was legally structured to put 2 girls through higher education. 2. The statements showed steady deposits all the way up until I was about 13. Then, the year after they sent me to Jasper, the pattern broke. Major withdrawals began. Large sums, tuition payments, elite summer programs, private cello lessons, an expensive boarding school, then a private university. All of it flowing toward one name, Genevieve's. My half of that trust, the half with my name legally bound to the account, the half meant to make me a veterinarian without a decade of crippling debt, had been drained to the very last cent by the time I turned 17. They hadn't just decided not to spend their own money on me. They had stolen what was already set aside for me, feeding it dollar by dollar into the daughter they had chosen to keep. I sat with that for a long while. I thought about the nights I'd lain awake doing the agonizing math on vet school loans. The years Julian and I ate canned soup so we could make our monthly payments. The way I'd told myself it built character. There had been money. It had my name on it, and they'd taken it. I didn't cry, and I didn't smash anything. I'm not built that way. Instead, I did what Jasper taught me to do during a difficult delivery. I got steady. I lined the statements up in chronological order. I noted the dates. I began very quietly to build the case my grandmother had laid the foundation for. I brought the cedar box to Miriam 2 days later and watched her go through it with the precision of a surgeon. She handled the bank statements by the edges, making small, sharp notes on a legal pad. When she got to the manila envelope, she opened it, scanned the notarized pages inside, and went entirely still. "Where did your grandmother get this?" she asked. I told her. "The bank, the legal way." Miriam nodded slowly. "This isn't just cold-hearted, Vera. This account had both girls as named beneficiaries. Moving the entirety of one minor beneficiary's share to the other without legal consent, that's not just a family argument. Depending on how the trust was structured, that's a serious breach of fiduciary duty, possibly actionable." I asked what that meant in plain terms. "It means," she said, "that if your parents are foolish enough to come after Adeline's estate, they'll be doing it while standing on a landmine of their own making. They're throwing stones from inside a glass house." She set the papers down. "I'm not telling you to sue them. That's your call, and it's a heavy one. I'm telling you that you walked in here thinking you had a shield. You actually have a sword, too. The question is whether you have to draw it." I told her I didn't want a war. I just wanted to be left alone with the family I had built. Miriam gave me a long look over her reading glasses. "Then I suggest you make it very clear, very calmly, that going to war with you is a losing play. People only respect the boundaries they can see the walls of." My phone buzzed on her desk. A text from my mother. "Chirpy as ever. So glad you're coming." Saturday the 14th, 6 p.m., the Alpine Suite. The whole family will be there. Wear something nice. I looked at the message, then at the box, then at Miriam. She chose the stage. I said, "I'll bring the script." I didn't decide to go to that dinner out of weakness. I want that on the record. I decided to go because of where it was. The Alpine Suite is a private dining area at the only upscale restaurant in Silveridge. My town, not theirs. They were driving 3 hours into my territory to perform for an audience of aunts, uncles, and cousins, the extended clan my mother had spent decades managing. For 22 years, that audience had only heard one version of me, the difficult daughter, the one who chose to leave the cold, ungrateful girl now hoarding grandma's money. If I stayed home, that version won by default. If I went, I had one night, one room, and a table full of the only witnesses whose opinion my parents actually cared about. My mother's power came entirely from controlling the narrative in front of those people. So I would tell the story in front of them with the documents on the table, in a voice so quiet they'd have to lean in to hear me. That's the thing about people who scream. They can't survive someone who whispers. I spent that week building a folder. Just the essential documents, in order. The notarized copy of the custody transfer, the bank statements showing the drained trust, and a copy of Adeline's letter. I practiced what I'd say until it was short, true, and bulletproof. Julian watched me rehearse at the kitchen table one night. "Vera, are you sure you want to do this?" "No," I said. Then, yes, both were true. The one thing I was certain about was my children. Hazel is 7 and misses nothing. She had started asking questions about these grandparents she'd never met who were suddenly on the phone. I sat her and Leo down and told them, in kid-sized pieces, that sometimes grown-ups make bad choices and need time to fix them, but that they were loved completely. The kids would not be at that dinner. Julian would stay home with them. He wanted to be in that room beside me, but I needed him to be the steady anchor they came home to. I needed to walk in alone. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as the 12-year-old who had watched her family's warm kitchen window fade in the rearview mirror, finally grown, holding the truth on her own 2 feet. Julian pulled me close by the kitchen sink. "Whatever you decide to do in there," he whispered into my hair, "you've already won the part that matters. You've got us." I let myself lean on him for exactly 1 minute. Then I straightened up. Because Jasper taught me that you can be tired before the work and after the work, but never during it. The dinner was 3 days out. Genevieve texted twice more, nervous, asking if I was still coming, telling me she'd been thinking about our diner conversation. I told her I'd see her Saturday. I didn't tell her what I was bringing. Then, on Thursday, Miriam called me back into her office. She had a tone I hadn't heard from her before, careful, almost solemn. "I went looking for the custody records," she said, sliding a notarized document across the desk. I wanted to see what story the paper told. It was a voluntary transfer of guardianship, dated the spring I was 12. Signed by both Diana and Victor, it granted custody of me to Jasper Ingram. Indefinite, not temporary. And in the section marked reason, in my father's blocky print, parents unable to allocate adequate resources to both minors. Allocate adequate resources? Miriam read aloud. "They put it in writing, Vera. The lie your mother told, that you chose to leave, is demolished by a single sentence they signed themselves. My parents had no idea I had this. They thought the only version of history that existed was the one they had spent 22 years fabricating. They were walking into this dinner expecting to play the same hand they always played. They thought I had nothing. That was the last advantage they'd ever give me. The clock was ticking. The estate's formal settlement was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 3 days after the dinner. On that day, Adeline's will would be finalized, and the no contest clause would lock her assets safely in my name, unless they formally filed a challenge first. Your parents' lawyer has already sent a letter of intent to contest. Miriam warned me, citing undue influence on an elderly woman. It's a bluff, but they want to settle this before the court date. They want to pressure you into handing Genevieve a portion voluntarily, so it never goes before a judge who would see exactly what they did to that trust fund. It clicked. The dinner wasn't a family reunion. It was a tactical maneuver. Get me in a room full of relatives, apply 22 years of family guilt, and force me to sign away my inheritance before the bank statements made them legally vulnerable. They had 3 days. So did I. The Whisper campaign started 2 days before the dinner, orchestrated by Aunt Helena. The phone calls didn't come to me, they went around me. A cousin called, fishing for information. Would just think it's sad that Adeline cut everyone out. Helena says you were angling for it at the end. An aunt left a voicemail about how my poor parents were trying so hard to heal the family, only for me to remain cold and money-focused. Helena was running a PR campaign, and the narrative was simple. Vera abandoned the family. Vera manipulated a dying woman. Vera is hoarding what belongs to everyone. The old me would have called every cousin to defend herself. I didn't. You can't argue someone out of a lie. You can only show them a truer reality all at once in a room they can't run from. Helena thought she was burying me. She was actually building my audience. I spent Friday night preparing. I called the bank that had held the Crestview Family Trust and secured written confirmation of the closing transfers that had moved my share into Genevieve's private tuition accounts. Then my father called. The first time I'd heard his voice in over 2 decades. No sweetness, just the flat, transactional tone of a printer calculating overhead. Vera, he said, we need this dinner to go smoothly. Your sister is in a difficult position, and family helps family. You've done well for yourself. Your grandmother saw to that. It's time to be reasonable about sharing what is frankly more than your fair portion. I kept quiet. Then he said the words that proved he hadn't changed a single fraction of a degree in 20 years. We can only invest in one future, Vera. You understood that then. Understand it now? He said it like a proverb. The exact same sentence that had floated up through the floor grate when I was 11. He hadn't even bothered to rewrite the line. He just handed me, freely over the phone, the exact cold logic that had justified discarding his child. I heard you, Dad, I said quietly. I'll see you Saturday. I hung up, and for the first time that week, I slept like the dead. There was nothing wrong with me. There was only something wrong with the spreadsheet they had run my childhood on. Genevieve called me late the night before the dinner, her voice low, as if she were hiding in that basement. "I can't stop thinking about what you said at the diner," she whispered. "I've been going through my memories, and nothing adds up." She told me a memory I'd never had access to. A few months after I was sent away, she had asked our mother why I never visited. Diana had sat her down and said, "Vera chose to stay with Jasper. She's happier there. She doesn't really want to be part of our family, sweetheart. Some people are just like that. She made me think you didn't love us." Genevieve sobbed. "For 20 years, I thought you abandoned me. And the whole time, you were the one who got thrown away. And she made me believe it was your choice. I told her it wasn't her fault. She was a child handed a lie by the person she was supposed to trust. I asked her what she was going to do at the dinner. 'I don't know,' she whispered. But I don't think I can keep saying their words. The morning of the dinner, I did my rounds. A minor colic case, a routine check on a mare, a stable cat with an injury. The work grounded me. By late afternoon, I was home, laying out my clothes. I dressed simply. Dark trousers and a green wool sweater Aunt Evelyn had knitted for me years ago. I wanted her thread with me. I tucked the folder into my bag. I was halfway to the restaurant when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the family group chat, one they'd added me to days ago, likely to make me feel the warmth of inclusion. My mother had just sent a message, but she had sent it to the wrong thread. It was meant for my father or Helena, but it landed in front of all 30 relatives. It read, "Once she signs. Adeline's share over to Genevieve tonight. We put all this behind us. Don't let her leave without the agreement. Be warm, but firm." I screenshotted it immediately. Within a minute, the message was deleted, replaced by a flustered "sorry." "Wrong chat?" But you can't unring a bell. She had just handed me their entire motive, in writing, timestamp, to the exact audience she spent her life performing for. I pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet for 1 full minute. Then I picked up my bag, walked across the gravel, and opened the door to the Alpine Suite. Comment the word "Du Ement" in the comments if you've ever had to lay the cold, hard truth on the table for people who refuse to hear it. Let's stop keeping their secrets. The dining room was warm and dimly lit, a long mahogany table set for 15 under a heavy brass chandelier. The scent of roasted garlic and fresh bread filled the air. They were all there. My mother at the head of the table in her pearls, playing the gracious host. My father beside her, gray and heavy, his jaw tight. Helena, sharp-eyed, watching the door. And at the far end, small and pale, Genevieve. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second, then looked down. My mother saw me and lit up like a theater stage. "Vera!" "Oh, sweetheart, you made it." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me. I let her. My arms loose at my sides, she smelled of the same floral perfume from my childhood. Over her shoulder, I saw the table watching, measuring, the cold, ungrateful daughter had finally arrived to be shamed into doing the right thing. Dinner came in elegant courses, and so did the performance. My mother toasted to family reunited, weaving a soft, edited tale of how difficult it had been with me living, so far away, so hard to reach. People nodded. Helena dabbed her eyes. I ate my food and said very little, which they mistook for compliance. Then, over the main course, my mother turned up the heat. "You know," she said, addressing the table but looking directly at me, "Genevieve has been through such an awful time with the business and the divorce. And here we are, so blessed, especially some of us." A sharp, elegant glance at me. "I think this is our chance to take care of our own." Grandma Adeline, bless her heart, wasn't quite herself at the end. She made some decisions that weren't fair, but we can fix that tonight. As a family. My father set down his fork. "It's the decent thing to do, Vera. Share what you were given. Make it right." My mother reached over, patting my hand. "We're not asking for much, sweetheart. Just sign a little agreement tonight so we can all move forward." She had the paper folded right next to her plate, along with a pen. She had brought her own contract to my town, completely certain I would buckle under the weight of 15 pairs of eyes. I looked at the paper. Then I reached down, pulled the folder from my bag, and set it on the white tablecloth, right next to her wine glass. "You're right," I said quietly. "This family does deserve the truth, so let's start with mine." I opened the folder. The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. "This is a voluntary transfer of custody," I said, sliding the first page to the center of the table where my cousins could see it. Dated the spring I was 12, signed by Diana and Victor. It gave permanent custody of me to Uncle Jasper. "Dad, would you like to read the reason you wrote? Or should I?" I read it slowly into the quiet. Parents unable to allocate adequate resources to both minors. I didn't choose to leave. I said to the faces staring at the page. I was 12. My parents signed me away because they decided they could only afford one daughter. In writing. To a notary. An uncle picked up the paper, his brow furrowed, and passed it down. My mother's practiced smile shattered into something brittle. That's taken out of context?" She stammered. "We were struggling. You don't understand the pressure." "I understand it perfectly," I said. "You explained it to Genevieve. You told her I chose to stay away, that I didn't want to be part of this family." "Genevieve, is that what she told you?" The eyes of the room swung to my twin. Genevieve had gone entirely white, her hands gripping the mahogany table. My mother shot her a warning glare, the same look that used to silence both of us. But Genevieve wasn't a child anymore. As the custody paper made its way hand around the table, The family's carefully crafted narrative began to dissolve. "There's more," I said, pulling out the second set of documents. "This is the Crestview Family Trust, opened when we were young, funded by Adeline and our relatives to pay for our college. These are the bank statements." I pointed to the columns. My half of this trust was emptied to the very last cent by the time I was 17. Every dollar went to Genevieve's private tuition, boarding school, and college. I paid for my own education with 10 years of loans. You didn't just give me away. You spent me. The room was suffocatingly quiet. And then my father, unable to let his calculated logic go undefended, stood up and barked at the table. Did what any practical parent would do. "You don't waste resources on a long shot. We could only invest in one future." The words echoed under the brass chandelier. 15 witnesses sat frozen. He had just confessed, loudly and proudly, to every single accusation, in front of the only people whose respect he had spent his life trying to buy. My mother buried her face in her hands. Too late. He had authenticated the evidence himself. Helena tried to salvage the wreck. She stood up, her voice shrill. "This is absurd!" "Vera, you've twisted everything. You poisoned Adeline's mind at the end, and now you're putting on a theatrical show to keep money that belongs to this family." I pulled out my phone. "Aunt Helena, you talk about bad faith?" I said. "Let's show everyone what bad faith actually looks like." I turned the screen toward the table and read my mother's accidental group text aloud. "Once she signs Adeline's share over to Genevieve tonight, don't let her leave without the agreement. Be warm but firm." I passed the phone down. The cousins who had been whispered to just days before read the text and looked at Helena with disgust. One of them said quietly, "You told us she was the one manipulating things." This was a setup. Helena sank back into her chair, silent. And at the far end of the table, Genevieve stood up, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling but clear. "When we were 12, she said, looking at our mother, you told me Vera chose to leave. You made me believe my sister abandoned me. You stole my sister from me and let me spend 20 years hating her for it so I wouldn't ask where the money went." She turned to our mother, whose mask had completely slipped. Diana stood up, her face twisted in rage, screaming at both of us. "After everything I sacrificed!" "Do you have any idea what I gave up for this family?" "You ungrateful, selfish girls!" "I did what I had to do." She shrieked at the room, red, faced, and raw, showing the entire extended family the monster she had hidden behind her pearls for 22 years. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, and let them watch. When she finally ran out of breath, the room was dead silent. I stood up unhurried and gathered my papers back into the folder. I didn't gloat. Jasper taught me, you don't kick a downed animal. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "Adeline's will is legally binding. On Tuesday, the estate transfers to me. As for the trust fund, my lawyer has the records. You moved money out of an account with my name on it while I was a minor. Victor, you might want to consult your own attorney about that before you speak to me again." My father's face was gray as ash. He realized, too late, that his desperate play had handed me the very leverage that could ruin him. "To the rest of you," I said, to the aunts, uncles, and cousins, "you were lied to. I don't hold it against you. I hold it against the people who spun the lie. I looked at my mother. Mom, you spent my childhood managing what this family believed about me. Tonight, you can't manage it anymore." I walked down the length of the table, stopped in front of my sister, and placed Miriam's business card in her hand. "That's my lawyer," I whispered. "Not for the estate. For you. If you want to get out of that basement and stand on your own feet, she can help you do it. When you're ready to stand as an independent sister. Not as a bank, not as a rescue. Call me. I've spent enough of my life being someone's overhead. I won't make you mine." Genevieve nodded, sobbing, clutching the card. I squeezed her shoulder once, picked up my bag, and walked out of the Alpine Suite room into the clean, dark Colorado night. The estate settled that Tuesday. Once my parents' lawyer saw the custody agreements and the trust fund statements, they quietly withdrew their intent to contest. Adeline's house and savings passed to me without a fight. The trust fund is being resolved legally through Miriam's office. It will take time, but it will be settled by law, not by guilt. A month later, a cold letter arrived from my parents' attorney, informing me that I had been officially removed as a beneficiary from their will. I signed the acknowledgement with a smile. They had taken back a place in a family that had only ever measured my worth on a spreadsheet. I traded a seat at their table for absolute peace. In June, Genevieve drove out to the ranch. We sat on the porch and watched Hazel and Leo run through the peach trees. We are rebuilding our relationship from scratch, carefully, the way you approach a hurt animal. It's not fully healed, but the door is finally open. Sometimes I park outside Adeline's old house, now rented to a young family who keep chickens. And I thank the woman who spent her final years building me a shield out of bank statements and love. She gave me the one thing they never would proof, and with it, peace. Because family isn't the people who can afford to keep you. It's the people who never once did the math. Thank you for listening to their secret stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and I'll see you at the next table.